Welcome to the Freight Project Podcast, brought to you by Ceresys, a North American third-party logistics company providing shippers transportation management technology and solutions.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Freight Project Podcast. On today's podcast episode, Ceresys welcomes back one of our key partners, Kevin Hill, co-founder of CarrierList. We welcome Kevin back as he speaks to his vast carrier database, as well as shippers, 3PLs, and other transportation entities, getting the frontline information as it relates to both transportation data and over-the-road transportation pricing. On this episode, Kevin will share, as he has these daily conversations with carriers, what they are looking for that would make a shipper get that elusive shipper of choice status. Kevin and I then discuss what is the difference between contract and spot rates and where Kevin thinks both are headed for the rest of 2019. Further, Kevin's knowledge allows him to give an outlook on if he thinks we are headed for a freight recession in 2019, and if the freight market will shift to be more advantageous for shippers near the end of the year and heading into 2020. And finally, Kevin will share how the ELD mandate is ultimately a long-term positive change in the industry that will allow for more data gathering, analysis, and increased collaboration as shippers build out their own carrier databases made up of the best carriers for their freight. We hope you enjoy this episode of the Freight Project Podcast. Hello, Kevin, and thanks for joining us once again on the Freight Project Podcast. Now, as a reminder to our listeners, because you were one of our early guests, you're a co-founder of the company CarrierList, who has built a more active database full of carriers. You've removed the waste found in a lot of carrier databases. That's good. And so data integrity is at the heart of that, and it is vital in all aspects of freight and logistics. And you've proven that with the success of your company. In creating this database, and as you continue to even work on it even more, make it more effective for your customers, you interface with a ton of carriers. You actually talk to them. You don't just pull them off a website. And at Ceresys, one of the things we really talk about is gaining the elusive shipper of choice status by making sure your freight is attractive to drivers. And it's all about the drivers. We just recently did a webinar about this where we got to treat drivers and carriers with a lot more respect. They're very important in all of this. So with that said, can you share with us what you may have uncovered in talks with drivers and what they are looking out for that would help shippers gain that shipper of choice status?
First of all, Adam, thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak with you and everyone out listening. And it's a great segue, right? You mentioned respect and your recent webinar, and that's really what it is, right? To become a shipper of choice, you have to frame all your interactions with carriers in respect, and that's what we hear on a daily basis, right? So we talk to hundreds of carriers a day. Dispatchers to get kind of what their business model is and what they're looking to do, what lanes they're looking to run. And, we do our phone calls with that respect as well. So shipper of choice, everyone's looking to become a shipper of choice. And there's a lot of answers out there, but really the simple explanation is respect, right? Respect for their time when they're coming in to load and unload. Especially with the ELD mandate, it puts a pretty strict limit on their earning potential if they're stuck at your dock. Safety, right? Respect for health, having a very safe environment where drivers can feel secure in loading and unloading and getting in and out safely. Number 3 would be respect with kind of the buy-in to the entire process, right? Why this load's important, how it fits into your supply chain, your customer's supply chain, your vendors' operations, right? So, and all of those, giving them a little bit more explanation of why this is important is a big, because everyone likes to buy into a larger purpose, and that's a big step toward getting driver buy-in and carrier buy-in to make those strict delivery times, right? Or those strict kind of guidelines for handling freight. And then lastly, really it's all about about money at the end of the day, right? So having respect for how capital intensive trucking is and how much capital it takes to operate a truck and kind of that break even point. All your partners, all your vendors, all your customers, everyone wants each other to earn a healthy profit. So the same carriers can keep showing up at your door or your dock day after day and have that experience to handle your freight expertly.
Well, a mix of what? Aretha Franklin and a little bit of Rodney Dangerfield. And maybe in the freight world, we lean a little more Rodney Dangerfield in our attitude and tone so we can get that RESPECT, just a little respect.
Just a little respect.
And that's my best Rodney Dangerfield impression. And don't ask me to do an Aretha Franklin one. I'll definitely get some hate mail on that one. I don't think it'll fly. But, now that we know a little bit more about, drivers, needs and what carriers are looking for from shippers in order to get that shipper of choice status, and I think that was really important how you boiled down to how they make money, right? And so let's talk a little more about rates and that subject. And you actually had a recent blog post from your blog. The title of the blog is Contract versus Spot Rates. And as we know, spot rates were high in the summer, but dropped off towards the end of the year as contract rates begun to soar themselves. So can you share what is the difference between the two? So we're all on the same page with how you see contract versus spot rates. And where do you think both are headed for the rest of 2019?
Sure. The chart on my blog post is actually research from Michigan State University, Dr. Jason Miller, who sends me some stuff quite a bit, and he tracks contract rates versus spot rates. And the contract rates were from the PPI or actually the BLS, and the spot rates were from TruckStop. And the difference between the two is it's kind of a gray area, really, right? Because you have contract rates. FreightWaves actually did a really good article on this a couple weeks ago on what exactly, contract rates are sometimes referred to as paper rates, right? So when the market's in equilibrium and everything's going good and there's not too much volatility, by the time from the time you sign the contracted rates until they end, they go pretty good. But once either spot rates like we saw in 2018 that exploded upwards, right? So a lot of carriers were moving their capacity from their contracted rates into the spot market to capture that premium that the spot market was running. And on the broker side, you'll see brokers going back and trying to get rate hikes because they're kind of underwater because they're buying on the spot market too. So when times are good, the contract rates work really well. When you see some volatility, in the same way, if spot rates sink down, right, you're going to see the reverse of rising spot rates, right? You're going to see the other parties go back in and start renegotiating to even out. So on that point of it, so you saw in early 2018, everything was out of balance, right? The spot rate was well above the contract rate. So shippers were going back to carriers and brokers to rebid to increase rates to get capacity, right? And you saw that happening all the way into, August, September of 2018, where spot rates really plateaued, right? And now they're coming down off those lofty highs, more into the real world. And what you're seeing is, and what we've been hearing as well from both carriers and brokers, are shippers are now starting to come back and claw back some of the rate hikes that they did, right, that they agreed to whenever capacity was really tight and spot market rates were high. You're seeing that reverse of it right now. And you're going to see that going through the rest of the year, really. There's contracted rates that were double digit increases last year, or going to maybe be 5-6% decreases going forward. So that's what we're going to see. Freight market's pretty equilibrium right now, and probably without any unforeseen shocks to the system. you're going to see that continue through 2019.
Okay. So, let's dig a little bit more into that, into the future. I've started reading some economists start predicting maybe a recession in 2020. And typically the freight market starts to see indications of a larger economy sooner than the rest of the economy. So in your conversations with both carriers, drivers, and shippers, what are you hearing? Will shippers be in a stronger position to demand more from carriers in late 2019 and early 2020? What does the freight market really look like towards the end of this year and going into 2020?
A very good question, Adam. Everyone has their crystal balls out, right?
And if we were all 100% accurate, we'd be trillions.
We would, right? We would. Like the start off, the shipper of choice is a very simple, respect. Just frame everything in respect. I think it's a very simple explanation for me to what I'm looking at going into 2019 and 2020. It's kind of all about tariffs, right? Global trade and tariffs, right? I think that's the real boogeyman out there. And we pulled forward a lot of demand early through the third and fourth quarters of 2018. And right now we're still pulling forward some demand from China, importing those containers and those products in to beat any tariff deadline, right? So inventories are pretty high right now. And if you see, we're looking at Ontario, California, and just literally they're at 100% capacity on warehousing, right? And I think they're actually sending truckloads of product up to around Stockton, California to get any spare warehousing capacity there is, right? So once you have inventories that high, it's going to take a while to work those off, right? So production is going to stop. I think there's some layoffs going on in China because the reorders aren't coming in at the same pace because we're stocked up here and on the West Coast. So I think that's the one danger, and I think it's going to be a sluggish economy just because of that, right? We have to work through inventories. Margins will take a hit as liquidations start taking up, sell pricing, right? Starts materializing probably in the second half of 2019 heading into 2020. And if that's the worst thing that happens, then we're going to see a sluggish economy for the next 6 months or so. If there's any other external shocks or tariffs that really go into effect, 25% tariffs from China, there's a lot more danger. And also crude pricing, right? Crude pricing is a good leading indicator too. So if we go down from here, this is probably not good news for the overall economy.
Right. And really what we're talking about is a lot of data, right? We're talking about inventory levels are high, which were purchased in expectation that there might be higher tariffs. So that way, those companies aren't paying those. And so now we're flush with inventory. And, we also have other factors that are going on as well, things that are impacting drivers themselves. Now, one of those things that's an important regulation to keep an eye on is how carriers and truckers continue to work with the ELD mandate. And a lot of them have already folded that into their day-to-day operations. Now, instead of it being a negative, and I think it's kind of been viewed that way, it's not necessarily a negative. It's a change, but change can be viewed negatively, especially in our industry. But because that might provide more data coming out of trucks, how will that ELD data perhaps integrate into, say, maybe a transportation management system like our Ceresys Rater, or maybe into future data-driven platforms in the supply chain like dock scheduling software? Will that help make shippers who are thinking about continuing to get shipper of choice? What do you think?
I think it will. I think it will be ubiquitous, right? So the ELD data that is in really the early stages, people are just trying to figure out how to use it right now, how to slice and dice it and analyze it. That's going to be in everything. very soon, right? 2 or 3 years, right? It's going to be in every TMS system. It's going to really increase visibility. So you're going to be able to see where the trucks are on the road. And it's going to simplify supply chains, and, shippers really want the visibility, right? And they're going to have that visibility very, very soon. For dock scheduling, that's probably going to be one of the earlier adopters, right? So you can see which trucks you have on the road, where they're located at, the hours of service, right? So you can really calculate congestion, weather. You can put all these into a calculation to say at 96, 97% certainty when that truck's going to arrive, right? And then you can automate that scheduling from there, right? Which is going to save shippers especially a ton of money, right? A ton of resources to be able to do that. So that's like the first stage of it. And then the Holy Grail is to layer on more AI capabilities on top of the ELD data. And then you not only have the visibility, where the truck's going to be in 6 hours or 72 hours, but you also kind of have the data to support the decision making of maybe the driver or carrier, where they've been, over the last 6 months, or, using historical patterns to forecast out where they're looking to go from there, right? And then you can serve up loads to them based on those algorithms that they'll come up with, right? And you're seeing that in the beginnings with the freight matching apps. I think there's still, pretty rudimentary on that part, just because of the ELD data. Once you have the ELD data and that's mature and really usable and predictable, then you're going to see the AI algorithms come in, and you're going to see a very sophisticated system for transportation management.
Well, that's a pretty exciting time, and that's why I think the ELD mandate, although a big change, could be instrumental in continuing, the digitization of the supply chain, and that integration capability between all these different systems, whether it's yard management, warehouse management system, that dock scheduling software, the TMS, ultimately those all need to play together. And the more data we have, the more efficient we can be, where we can focus on things that are harder, collaboration with those carriers and those drivers, to get back to the very first thing that we mentioned, in order to get shipper of choice. So that way all players are appropriately compensated for their work. And that's a great place for us to be, all while having good visibility and getting out of the weeds of process. Now, one of the things that we always talk about here at Ceresys, because our TMS does, help you rate and get your freight shipments for, over the road modes, truckload, LTL, and parcel, is it opens you up to a broad carrier database. And you can see those right in the system. Partly on our truckload side, powered by Carrier Lists, your company. Mm-hmm. So a lot of companies out there, they say that they have hundreds of thousands of relationships with carriers. I always wonder, though, and we try to remain realistic. We don't state that here at Ceresys. How many active for-hire carriers are really on the road these days?
Sure, it's a question that I've been trying to find an answer to for better on a year now, or really a year and a half, or really whenever I started Carrier List 2.5 years ago, right? And there's not a lot of good information out there to draw from, and I've talked to a lot of people, and everyone's, I think pretty close in line with a true number. But going back to companies who say that we have 100,000, hundreds of thousands of relationships, right? We both have large networks on LinkedIn, right? A lot of connections, but who do we really contact and talk to on a daily basis, or even ever, right? It's a very tiny percentage of that, right? So most brokers have a very core carrier base, right? And those 20% of your carriers are probably pulling 80% of your freight, and that's normal, right? Pareto rule crosses all kinds of bounds. But with the ELD data coming on, we're going to get a more accurate picture of who's really out there on the road, working and driving on a regular basis, right? Because right now we have the FMCSA census file, which is, self-reported data that trucking companies, interstate trucking companies, right? That's how they register and keep current with the federal government. A lot of people out there, you'll see a lot of disconnected numbers in that. You'll see a lot of private fleets that have authority for hire, but they just don't use it. And then you have a lot of people, tow trucks and people that are licensed together to haul other people's property, but it's not really what we think of as freight, right? Normal, consumer products or industrial products. Some of us has hazmat, or not hazmat, but environmental cleanup, right? Things that you don't really broker out, or most shippers don't really, aren't really looking for. So you go through that, and there's probably like a third of those companies that aren't really even around. But going back to a count of active for hire interstate trucking companies, you're looking at about 250,000 to 270,000 on any given month. And about 50,000 of those run 5 or more trucks. About 100,000 of those are owner operators. And then the remainder, 100,000 run between 2 and 4 trucks. So it's kind of a moving target, and something that I've been trying to figure out. Kind of that's the carrier side. On the trucking side, you're looking at about 1 million to 1.2 million interstate for hire trucking companies out there. So, So if you're not trucking companies out there, I'm sorry, trucks out there on the road.
Trucks.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So if you're just working with just a tiny percentage of that, you're going to get a very broad reach of the market.
Yeah. And you're doing your best to help make sure that, when people work with Carrier List, that they're getting active carriers and that they have a really good view of the capabilities of those carriers. And, we're doing the same with our TMS to make sure that our shippers have access to that and that it is, reliable carrier information. And that's very important. And I think that's only going to increase in the supply chain, where data becomes a very valuable asset. In fact, Dr. Yoshi Sharif just said yesterday, he's from MIT originally. I think he's on his own now, but he said that data is becoming even more important than people as an asset. And that's one of the first big supply chain thought leaders to really state that. Now, I think he's not saying that people aren't important. They're a very close second, if not equal to that data. But I think data will only continue to be more and more important. And of course, you, Kevin, and us at Ceresys are doing our best to make sure shippers have and all entities around shipping have the most available, accurate data possible for, getting that shipper of choice status and being able to move freight that they need to move without too much money and too many resources. So thanks for your quest in that. Thanks for being a great partner for us here at Ceresys as well. And thanks again for being on the Freight Project podcast. We'll have to have you back on again if you're up for it.
Always up for it, Adam. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And
yeah.
Look forward to doing it again.
Yeah. And thanks for everybody for listening to the Freight Project podcast. As always, we'll see you next week. Take care.